You're not supposed to sit there and ask questions, you're supposed to find a question from the audience.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much. I thought I'd keep something on. I'm wondering what I'm doing. Why don't we start with, why don't we start with you?
What about aging at the population level, such as the rise and fall of empires? And when the whole population, like let's say we belong to a certain empire, and it declines. So the amount of resources that can be used by that population also decline. Do you worry about that kind of aging?
No.
And why not?
I'm a first things first sort of guy, you know. I mean, I'll worry about that when it happens.
Can I make a suggestion? Hand the microphone to the person in the audience. Please present your name and then who you're directed to.
Very good.
Do we have another microphone? Another roving microphone?
That would be great if we had another one. Okay, in the meantime, why don't we do that? So you're next.
Affiliation. I'm arcing after retirement careering. I don't have an affiliation anymore. I'm free. I do what I like. Question for Coeurnelle. Do you think government should be thinking about life and death policy, like who lives, who dies, how many kids, that kind of thing?
Give Didier the microphone.
Okay.
Do you think government should be worrying about policy for access to this technology and who lives and who dies?
Yeah, well, sure. It was my main point that the public institutions should invest in research concerning technologies making it possible for people to live longer. But there was not a question? No?
I'll say it in French.
No. Say it in English.
Say it again.
Bon, en français?
No, in English, so everybody can understand.
Okay. If we get radical life extension,
yes,
and say people are irresponsible, and the population grows crazily, then obviously we need some kind of government policy. Who lives? I mean, there's a movie. There's a movie about this. Who lives? Who dies? How many kids? That kind of thing.
But, okay, that was also one of the main points of this. There were studies, and if you have people able to live even forever on the short and middle-long term, it doesn't mean a big rise of the population. And until now, when the people live longer, they tend to have less children. So there's the problem the problem of overpopulation is more a problem when the people live shorter than when they live longer. Of course, when you take a very long-term perspective, like 100 years, if people don't die and they continue to have children, at one moment in the far history, you will have to think, is it, for example, this classical choice, you have to choose between having children or living without rehabilitation. But the problems of projections concerning the far future is they are never correct. And also we have 1 century to think about it. Just from 50 years from here, even if there is no mortality due to old age anymore, the problem of overpopulation will not be a big problem if we have the same fertility rate, and certainly not if the fertility rate is decreasing. So it's a false problem, certainly in the next 50 years. Except if the people, when they can live forever, begin to have more children, but I think the probability is about nothing.
Microphone.
Hold 1 second. We have a roving microphone now.
I just wanted to ask if you correlating something that's not actually causal. So, for example, people will say that birth rates go down because of education levels, not because of longevity, for example. So,
correlation is not causation.
No, give it one. So of course that's true, but the general opinion, the general view is yes, it's correlation, not causation, but that's because it's shared causation. In other words, education on the one hand causes better emancipation and lower fertility, and on the other hand it also causes better health and nutrition and so on, so it causes better longevity. So the two things go together.
How does that reduce population?
What it means is that you won't see an increase in birth rate per person just because you see an increase in longevity, because the two things, even though they're not causally linked, are still happening at the same time.
You know, I remember in the 1970s, all these guys in the US were writing books saying that we were all going to starve to death by the 80s or 90s because we were going to run out of food. And, you know, there was no population bomb, right? It didn't happen. The fertility rate has gone down in parts of the developed world, and food production technology advanced in a lot of ways, albeit with some problems as well. So I think, as Didier said, in the long-term future, even 100 years from now, all sorts of wacky things could happen. We could have a singularity. We could have superhuman robots roaming around. We could take the plants apart and reconfigure their molecules into food or new bodies. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. I think the key point I see in Didier's talk is that there's not like a near-term population bomb now any more than there was in the 1970s when people were saying that. The demographics is complex. The people's motivations for reproducing are complex. But there's really no solid argument to say, ooh, if there was an immortality pill that was released tomorrow that would stop us from dying involuntarily from aging, that all of a sudden the earth would just fill up with people and would be overwhelmed. There's really no sound basis for making that supposition. And when you go further out, there's a lot of other uncertainties and things do become confusing.
Yeah, and also, still on the short term, if it is tomorrow possible for the people to live forever, and also for the woman to have children forever, that will, one of the consequences will be that the woman on the short term will have less children because you can delay it, okay? And like Aubrey said, everything is related, but the fact is, at the moment, where life expectancy is rising, people have less children, and the only problem that we have, it's a problem of not enough people, for example, in European countries, okay? So, once again, in the short and middle long term, no problem, and in the very long term, projections concerning overpopulation, of projections concerning population, if you take a look of two projections 100 years ago, everything was not correct. So it's and we have time to think about it.
Actually, somebody did a study on what happens if tomorrow if you remove the natural aging and the death process. And people still die. They die from accidents and other things, right? So actually, the chance of you living to 1,000, if you eliminated aging, is still sort of less than 10%, according to that study.
Okay, assuming hopefully safely that everybody in this room likes what you guys are doing, likes your message, if you were to tell them to do one or two things, go away and do one or two things that would help you further your goals, what would those one or two things be?
Microphone.
Is that the first
No, let's each do two. Go on. You want me to start? All right. Okay, well, the number one thing I would do, which applies to absolutely everybody, is advocacy. There's a good reason why I spent a lot of my talk, more than I usually do, talking about the ways in which I address the various concerns and reservations that people express when confronted with this prospect. And, of course, as those of you who've been following what I've written and what I've spoken about over the years will know, I've got a lot of other specific answers to different things. It's worthwhile taking the time to actually learn the best answers. I'm not saying that I necessarily have all the best answers, but to learn the best answers to give to these things so as to actually wear people down, to soften people up, so that eventually we get a shift in public opinion in favor of this work sooner rather than later. That's going to happen when we get sufficient progress in the science, but the more we soften people up, the more we get people to be comfortable with the idea of defeating aging with medicine, the sooner that will actually happen, the less impressive the required results in the lab will be.
Yeah, I think advocacy is certainly a major point, and humanity now is in a strange position. You can think of us as being a bunch of guys living in a sort of jail or something, and we have the materials to build a staircase to get out of that jail to where there's a lot cooler stuff to do, but we're not actually working together to use those materials to build that staircase out. And why? Well, some of the materials for the staircase are owned by one guy, some are owned by some other guy, and besides, building stairs is really boring compared to like having sex and playing video games and so on. So we'll just kind of sit down here in this jail and fiddle around instead of cooperating together to build the staircase to get out of the jail. And I think that's how those to follow us in 50 or 100 years are going to look back at what we're doing now. I mean, I think there's a lot of hard science and engineering problems facing us in doing things like curing aging and building superhuman AGI, but yet these are science and engineering problems that we have the basic capability to solve, and the percentage of humanity's resources that's going into solving them is astoundingly small compared to the resources going into making face cream, more chocolatey chocolates, and weapons for blowing people up. So what each of us can do about this situation is kind of individual. I mean, if you're a scientist or an engineer, you can make an effort to direct your career toward things with the potential to make a huge difference for the human race rather than fiddly little problems. I mean, if your talents lie elsewhere in terms of writing, organizing, business, and so forth, I mean, it's in a way for each of us to work out the way to best contribute. But the main thing I observe is an incredibly small percentage of the human population is concerned with orienting their lives toward effecting the massive improvements that should be possible in the fairly near term.
Didier, are you developing technologies? You're a philosopher, right?
Yes.
He's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer. Okay. So what people could do, and I'm just going to be totally crass, make sure Didier can work on his theories. Give Aubrey and Ben $1 billion each, and me too. And yeah.
Is that Hong Kong or U.S. dollars?
U.S.
Okay.
I want to say, I'll take $1 billion Hong Kong dollars.
Oh, so
I'll take the remainder of your $1 billion U.S. then. We're going to do it.
Okay, seriously, for me also advocacy. For me, one of the curious, maybe one of the most fascinating aspects of life extension for me at the moment is the fact that people are not fascinated. Why? Because they are not conscious of the fact that we will be able to live much longer in a relatively short term. But after that, once that the people will be convinced, one of the biggest challenges for me is to convince them that it will be for everybody on the short term, and it means, among other things, a really huge investment of public institutions. And also it means there is also the question about patents and so on. We didn't speak about it until now, but I think it's important to at least to be sure that it will that these technologies will be available to everybody, not to everybody, but to most people in a short term.
Now that we've heard the Christmas wish list from our panel,
I think we heard a lot today about. My name is Kannan. I'm an undergrad student at PhD University. We heard a lot about how we can extend life today, but I have a slightly more long-term sort of question. Because a lot of things in human society are based upon the assumption that humans are eventually going to die and the next generation is going to come. For example, I'm an undergrad student and I'm being educated under the assumption that what they're teaching me is going to allow me to be a useful person for the next 50 years. And in 50 years, there'll be other 20-year-olds being educated who take it on. But if and when we come up with technologies that let me live forever, do you have any thoughts on how society is going to be when my thoughts are going to be outdated and my habits are going to be outdated with dealing with the challenges of 100 years, of 500 years, but I'm still going to be around?
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, putting the question in perhaps a more general way, I think basically what you're asking is, what are we going to do about ossification? About the fact that people who were born a long time ago are not so good at being creative and novel and all that sort of stuff. Now, first of all, the first thing I want to say is I prefer to be non-creative and healthy than creative and full of Alzheimer's disease. And I think most people in the audience would too. But also, more than that, we've got to look at why people are less creative in general when they're older than when they're younger, and what we can say about what we might be able to do about it. Now, of course, at this point, we really don't know. One possibility is that a large proportion of why people are less creative when they're older is because their brains are filling up with crap. I mean, physical crap, right? Not cognitive crap. So if we're going to fix that, which is of course part of the whole plan, then suddenly we may see a very great change in that phenomenon. There are of course other corresponding things at the social level. It may be that actually older people could be just as creative as younger people if they didn't have so much time to go drinking. You know, if they had more time, if they had time to you get the idea. So, I mean, you know, it could be a societal change that needs to take place. One thing that I feel is almost certain to be useful is to restructure things so as to encourage people to move to different careers every so often. There's an enormous tradition of people, I think I'm a fairly good example of this actually, moving careers. I was originally a computer scientist, and actually when Kent was using Flybase, I was actually working for Flybase. But yeah, I mean, you know, it was very useful for me for doing that. I was able to make good contributions very quickly. That happens in other areas, not just science. So.
Yeah, the other thread that should be introduced to this discussion, I think, is the variety of other technologies that are likely to advance at the same time as life extension. So it's interesting, science fictionally, to think about what happens if people can live much longer and nothing else changes. But in reality, let's say you have brain-computer interfacing as well, where you can have the fabled cranial jack from Neuromancer, where you can plug the internet or various microprocessors into your brain, let alone superhuman AIs communicating with you via that cranial jack, or a host of other interesting things that could come about that will have large and synergetic effects with life extension, which are difficult to predict, but could certainly intervene in the ossification problem that you mentioned in a variety of ways.
Very short. So I agree with what was said, but also, once again, it's not going to happen tomorrow. You know, the first person to reach 150 years will be there not before the year 2050. At the moment, the oldest woman in the world is 115 years old, and she's not in good shape. So don't worry, this problem is, we have time to think about it a very long time.
We can take, what, 2 more questions given the time.
Sure. Question for Aubrey. The metabolic processes that you're looking at aren't specific to humans. So there might be applications near-term or far-term of the technologies that deal with the accumulated damage outside of life extension and so on. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, sure. So specifically, if you're asking about the applicability of these technologies to other species, which is what I think you were asking about, is that what you want me to answer? That's part of what you're saying. Okay, so turns out if you think about the mathematics of longevity escape velocity, which I explained in quite a lot of detail today, then it's going to be much harder to achieve longevity escape velocity for short-lived species, like for example domestic pets, than it is for humans, because you've got to carry on improving the therapies fast enough to cope with the problems that are still accumulating. That means you've got to do it faster to achieve longevity escape velocity for a shorter-lived organism that's aging faster than for a long-lived organism. I don't believe that we'll ever have longevity escape velocity for mice, for example, though I'm certain that we will get the equivalent of robust human rejuvenation for mice much sooner than we get it for humans. So, you know, that's part of it. Another part of your question might be the applicability of these technologies to specific diseases that may affect people in earlier parts of life. There's undoubtedly going to be a lot of that, both the technologies themselves and the underlying enabling technologies that are needed as components of it, like, for example, good somatic gene therapy to fix up, you know, the genetic problems that people have that sometimes, of course, lead to early onset disease and death. So absolutely, there's going to be a great deal of applicability.
Okay.
thinking about the questions that were asked and the responses to the questions, it seems that two stand out in my mind anyway, advocacy and education. If Humanity Plus, for example, was to come up with a particular protocol, would your various organizations be involved with that protocol in addressing government officials and policy making? And as a segue for that, some of us have been consulted by the United States bioethics committees. I was just in contact by the French Parliament, speaking with the Conservative and the Socialist Party representatives about our views about whole brain emulation, the brain uploading, whatnot. And it was a very sad situation because the lack of information is predominant. So predominant, it's frightening. So I think one thing we need to do, and I think all of you agree with this, is advocacy. So again, back to my question, because this is something that is mounting and right around the corner for us in dealing with this broader scale global need of education and advocacy for our goals, would you be involved in such a protocol if Humanity Plus did present it to your various organizations?
Didier can go first.
Go first. I think we'll start.
The question was, what would I be involved?
Yep.
Working together to develop smarter and smarter AI that could be applied to life extension or many other things. So in that sense, OpenCog is kind of out of the explicit reach of any government, and that is by design rather than happenstance. I mean, our code resides on servers in many different countries, including China, the US, Brazil, Europe, and so forth. And if AI research is a somewhat simpler thing in terms of regulatory issues than biology, because we're typing code into computers, and computers are kind of about the same anywhere. So if some government was going to go nuts and say, well, you got to stop working on AI, that will be inconvenient to the guys living in that country working on it. But OpenCog development just shifts somewhere else. It doesn't really matter. But biology is a little different because there's expensive lab equipment and human trials and so forth. But I think the same principle pretty much holds. My view is that science is going to develop largely the way it wants to. There'll just be some noise along the way from governments. And stem cell research is one example of that. I mean, I remember, this is something where Joel Pitt, who's in the audience, Joel and I were looking into this when writing a paper on ethics of AI. There had been a bunch of noise about the US government under George W. Bush, the worst president in US history, who was going on about how stem cell research should be limited in certain ways because of ethical concerns he had related to his religion. And there was all this noise then, well, then stem cell research will move overseas, move to Korea, to China, and so forth. And when you look at what happened, if you look at the research record in stem cell research, that wasn't really the case. I mean, as Joel dug into it, like the main publications in stem cell research were still from the same US labs, and the states of California, New Jersey, and others put a bunch of money into stem cell research funded by the state, even though Bush put restrictions on federal government. And then Obama was elected president, who didn't have the same preconceptions as Bush anyway. That may have helped stimulate stem cell research in other countries, in Asia in particular, but ultimately the US didn't fall behind. So what seemed to me is that countries have a desire to make money that exceeds their concern with religions and these other kind of obsolete anti-technology ethical systems. So I feel like science is going to progress in a way that makes sense. So OpenCog is certainly happy to discuss these issues with governments as it comes up.
I think we're out of time. So
well, okay, just quick.
That's why you should have gone first.
So a quick comment. More general, sort of talking both about individuals such as ours and also about organizations. I think one thing that we always have to take into account in being realistic and pragmatic about interaction with governments is that within democracies, politicians care about one thing above all else, namely getting re-elected, which means that overwhelmingly public policy follows public opinion rather than leading it. So there's two ways in which one can approach governments in democracies. One can approach them in ways that will get them to actually do public policy changes that hasten the development of these radical technologies. but that is basically quixotic until public opinion changes, because they just won't do it. Or one can act rather more behind the scenes and get the thinking and the education, as you say, done in the absence of any actual public announcements of changes of public policy that will at least prepare the way for rapid response to those changes in public opinion as and when they happen. The other really important point, however, is that not every important country in the world is a democracy anymore. That there are countries that are not democracies that are becoming important anyway. I was in Kazakhstan just a month ago, and I must say I think I'll be going back there quite a bit, because they have a very forward-looking attitude to all of this, which comes from the very top, and which does not have this tedious inconvenience of having to bring the public with them. And you know, I would actually like to spend a great deal more time in China for a very similar reason, not least because they have a massive problem of population aging. I think if anyone else wants to comment, if we have time.
Well, it's a complicated question, but I think there is a big risk of a divide in the population, and so, like you said, advocacy and education are two very important questions, but here around there is a large consensus, this is a good thing, but in the general population there is no large consensus. For the biggest part, because the people don't know about it, but also for a smaller part because of religious aspects and yeah, people who at the moment at least want to die of old age. So we have to work together, but we have to be careful not to be too provocative. And well, to describe the situation, to speak about possible medical progresses, but to speak about the positive aspects and about the ethical, technical, political questions associated to them. Okay, and also on the other side is what Aubrey said. So you have also medical progresses and technological progresses in non-democratic countries, and you can, even if you want, you cannot avoid it.
And probably too dangerous.
I think we're out of time for questions, so please, you know, the panel's here, so the rest of the days we'll just please come and talk to them individually.
So next session at 2:30? Yeah.